Hello, welcome to Chapter 3 Podcast, the show for readers of science fiction, fantasy, and romance. This is Season 1, Episode 14. I'm Bethany, your host, and today I'm joined by Alan from the YouTube channel, The Library of Allenxandria, to discuss the Discworld books by Terry Pratchett. If you want to support the podcast and get early access to episodes and exciting bonus content from our guests, check out our Patreon linked in the show notes. And as an added bonus, right now, anyone who joins as a patron at the Trope Fiend level and above between now and May 1st will receive a custom Chapter 3 Podcast logo sticker and a mystery book in the mail. Very exciting, so go check that out. And a big thank you to all of our patrons, with a special shout out to our world-expanding patron, Trina. Your support helps make this possible. Before our conversation today, it's time for On My Radar, where I share recent or upcoming book releases in science fiction, fantasy, and romance I'm excited about, and then our guest will have the opportunity to share one as well. The books for today's episode will be released between March 31st and April 13th, 2021, with the exception of the guest recommendation, which may include any upcoming release. First up, on April 6th, I've got 4 books I want to talk about. We have Occulta by Maya Montaigne coming out. This is the sequel to Nocturna, which is a YA fantasy set in a Mexican-inspired world, dealing with the consequences of colonization, and it has one of the creepiest villains I've read in YA anytime recently. Definitely interested to check out the sequel. Also on April 6th, we have One Thing Leads to a Lover by Susanna Craig. This one is a historical romance following a widowed mother and a member of the British intelligence. I thought this one was really fun. It's got a little bit of a mystery subplot to it. Really, I think, underappreciated series. Then The Intimacy Experiment by Rosie Danon is a modern romance following a porn star turned sex educator and the progressive young rabbi who hires her to teach a series on modern intimacy at his synagogue. It's smart and thought-provoking, and I think genuinely romantic. I think this is going to be a real crowd pleaser. Then we have House of Hollow by Crystal Sutherland. This one's a YA thriller with magical elements, and it looks amazing. I've not read it yet, but I plan to very soon. It follows 3 sisters who disappeared as young girls, and when they reappear, they begin to change in strange ways. Then there's 2 books coming out on April 13th that I want to highlight. The Light of the Midnight Stars by Rena Rossner is a fairy tale inspired novel that combines fantasy, history, and Jewish folklore. I really love the first book by this author, and I look forward to this one. She's got this really gorgeous writing style that I think will lend itself well to the fairy tale-esque element. And the last book is Malice by Heather Walter. This one is a dark retelling of Sleeping Beauty, where the princess falls for the evil sorceress, which sounds really cool. So I have high hopes for this one. With that said, please join me in welcoming Alan to the show. Thank you for joining me.
Woo! Thanks for having me. This is super fun.
Yes, I'm excited. If you want to briefly introduce yourself to our listeners and share your pick for an exciting upcoming release.
Okay, I'm Alan Walker. My YouTube channel is the Library of Allenxandria, where I talk about, fantasy and science fiction, mostly fantasy. I'm also by day a classics teacher in high school, and so I tend to talk about that kind of stuff too, like Greeks and Romans, things like that. My pick for the upcoming release is The Fall of Babel, which is coming out, I think, November 9th by Josiah Bancroft, and it is book 4 of the Books of Babel, or the Senlin books, as I call them. And with the setup from book 3, man, I don't even know what setup's left to do. Like, it is just going to be nothing but, like, I don't know, climax for the book 4. But I am so excited.
That's awesome. I still need to read book 3, but I've read the first 2 books, and that's such
you read the first
series.
2? Awesome.
Yeah,
I thought you'd only read the first one.
I just read the second one last month.
Did you really?
I did.
Yes. Did you like it?
I did. It was great. I loved it. Yeah.
The characters, I just
so
like
good.
The extra characters you get in the second one are just so good.
Yeah, it adds a lot to it. And I appreciate too, whenever I can find a male fantasy author who writes good female characters,
yes.
Not all of them do. Like, this was very good.
100%. I tell people that those 3 female characters in Arm of the Sphinx are just they're so good, like, which is, unusual for for fantasy books, and it gets even better in the third one. Even more character work.
I'm excited for it. I'm excited. Yeah. So I do plan to read the third one soon too. Hopefully before the 4th one comes out. Yes. Awesome. Good pick. Okay. So tonight we are going to talk about Discworld. Alan is a big fan and was the catalyst for getting me to dip my toes into this world. So I just a couple days ago finished my very first Discworld book. I read Guards, so we can talk about that. But I also want to hear from you a little bit about your background in this, and we can talk more broadly about the world. And hopefully this will be helpful for listeners who are interested or who are already fans. We can kind of get into all that.
Well, my Discworld background in high school, a friend of mine recommended Hogfather, which is one of the Death subseries of Discworld books, because I'd always read fantasy, growing up, and I read it and I loved it. And this one, Death essentially has to become Santa Claus because the Santa Claus figure gets kidnapped, and so the Grim Reaper is Santa Claus, which is just an awesome premise, and it was just so bizarre. And I've always liked words and what Pratchett does with his prose and like the puns he makes and just the pop cultural references. Like, I was sold. And so I started the series from the beginning. Didn't love the first two books. Like, the first two books that he ever wrote, like, chronologically, are really more of a kind of a parody of like the sword and sorcery barbarian kind of fantasy books before he really hit his stride with Guards is really the first book that I think where it has all of the elements of Discworld that I really love. Mort, his fifth book, Mort, or book 4, Mort, was really where it started shaping up to be like what Pratchett books would become. But really, I think everything kind of comes together in Guards, which is why I always recommend people to start there. And then from there, like, all of his books have like, the standard Pratchett fare. And it's just so good. And it really, I've read all of them except I stopped reading fantasy for like 10 years. And so all the books that were published after I stopped reading for fun, I have not actually caught up on, but I've read most of the Discworld books.
Okay.
And Pratchett and his humor, along with like things like Eddie Izzard and like British humor, has just so defined like what I find funny. And so really, like, a lot of the stuff that I do and say, like, on my YouTube channel or just in my own writing or in my classes when I'm like lecturing something, just they still have their roots in the Discworld and the stuff that Pratchett always used to do. Like, just words that have double meaning and, clever puns and a little bit of the absurd. So
yeah, no, it's fun. I had a good time reading it, and I think especially early on, like, the humor is very reminiscent to me of Monty Python.
Yes.
Is a lot of what it reminded me of, which I find funny. So I was laughing quite a bit. I do think, and maybe part of this is because I was reading it. I tend to read books quicker, and so I think it was a long book for that. Maybe if I'd read it in shorter chunks, I would have continued to, I don't know, like, because I still found lots of it very funny, but it's weird though. It doesn't have chapter breaks. Are all the books like that?
Yeah, until like later on, yes. I think like somewhere around in the 30s, Going Postal, I think, is the first book that had chapters, and it's like in the 30s with his books. But yeah, none of them have chapters. They just have the POV breaks.
Yeah. That's so interesting. It was definitely a weird experience trying to figure out, okay, like, what's a good stopping point? I don't know.
Exactly. And Guards, it can feel a little long for just what's going on in that particular book.
Yeah.
Because you only have the four Watchmen. You've got Vimes, Carrot, Colin, and Knobs. But as the Watch books, which are my favorite of the sub-series because I just like that kind of detective noir kind of motif, the Guards books become Pratchett's way of addressing like the social issues of the time. And the Watch continues to expand. Like, I read somewhere where it says like Vimes is a very like progressive kind of guy, but not out of any like kind of progressive spirit, but more because he's not going to be told what to do. And his like hatred of the upper class that tries to take advantage of and treat the lower classes like crap. Like, Vimes is the class hero, but it's mostly out of his stubbornness. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so the next book, Men at Arms, deals a lot with like racism and kind of like affirmative action as the patrician forces Vimes to accept dwarves and trolls into the Watch. And Vimes is just a product of his upbringing where you hate dwarves and trolls because they're not men, they're not humans. And so he's like, and so he he learns that, I mean, he eventually comes to like, wait, like when you're in the watch, it doesn't matter. Like a watchman is a watchman.
Yeah.
And so it's dealing with like society and all that. And then the next book after that deals with like automation and robots, and like do like automatons have a soul? Like, what does it mean to like own somebody type thing?
Huh.
And so he just addresses these really big issues. And then Jingo is about the things that men at the top do to go to war so they can profit on it, and like blind patriotism. So
That's
I just
so
love,
interesting.
I just love what Pratchett does
It's
with
cool.
those
But
things.
in like kind of a funny, lighthearted
Correct.
way.
It
But
never feels
yeah.
preachy, just because of the like, because Vimes isn't this like white knight character. He's a cynic.
Yeah.
And so Pratchett's able to deal with these these social issues without being super preachy, just because of the what's being the backdrop that he's writing in.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. But then there's also things that I just think are so funny.
Yeah.
Like what was it, I mean, you probably know this better than I do, but the whole deal where they're introducing at the beginning all of the secret societies.
The elucidated brethren of the Ebon Knight.
Yes, like, exactly.
You can
I'm like,
tell,
oh, you're in the wrong place. Like they're a block down. Like it's
correct.
just like, it was just so funny.
Where he's knocking on the door and he
Yeah.
gives like, the multi like phrase
Yes.
password, and then they get to like the fourth phrase and it's like, are you sure the whale doesn't fly at midnight?
Yeah.
Because there's so many secret societies that like he's just at the wrong one.
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
Oh man, it's so funny. And and then the whole thing of, I think Carrot is such an interesting character.
Yes.
And the way he handles him, because he thinks he's a dwarf, but he's not.
Correct. It's very reminiscent of Elf.
Yeah. Yes, it is. That's true.
Yeah, where he's a 6 foot tall human. He was raised by dwarves. Very obviously the heir to Ankh-Morpork's ancient lineage. Yeah. And I think it works because he's not our main character.
Yeah.
Like, because he's such that paragon of virtue, like very literal minded, very like literally by the book. Like he goes through everything in the watch manual. And it would be less interesting if he was our main character and not Vimes.
Yeah.
And so just watching Carrot kind of bring that virtue to the watch, where Vimes had kind of given up because the watch, isn't taken seriously, and they run just fast enough to where it looks like they're running, but the criminals are sure to get away. But then Carrot comes up and just kind of shakes up their world, and they're like, you know what? Like, we should be like Carrot. We should be better than we are.
Yeah.
And so it's bizarre how Pratchett can keep Carrot interesting through all 8 of the watch books, because he remains interesting.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think because he's sort of, he is a paragon of virtue, but he's also kind of oblivious to
completely clueless.
So many things.
Completely clueless.
Which is just great. And even like small things, which again, like what you were saying, playing with words, there's a scene where Vimes, I think, tells him, okay, throw the book at him, and he literally throws a book.
Correct. Because we all understand that throw the book at him means like, bring justice upon them.
Right.
And Carrot takes the Ankh-Morpork watch handbook and literally hurls it at the fleeing criminal.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
It's like so many things like that. It's very funny. I think if that's your sense of humor, it's I had a good time with it. Like I do think I had some of those issues where I was like, okay, it's a little long.
Yeah.
I wish there were more chapter breaks. And maybe if I paced myself more, it would do. But I mostly had a really good experience with it and would be interested in reading more in this world.
Yeah.
So I'm glad I finally kind of dipped my toes into this, because
I'm glad.
It's daunting. There's so many books. Yeah.
But they are mostly standalone, and you can read them really in any order, as long as you're reading like within the sub-series, as long as you're reading like book 1 of the watch before book 4 of the watch.
Okay.
But otherwise, like, you could literally move to a completely different sub-series and just read the first book of that and have it make sense.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. Okay, well, why don't you give a quick rundown for anybody listening who's not super familiar with what
With this-
Discworld is and how it functions, like what are things people maybe should know going in?
Well, Discworld is a world very much like our own, and this is how Pratchett uses to kind of like poke fun at the foibles of humankind and of our world. But instead of a globe, it's a disc. It's literally a flat disc that is on the back of four giant elephants that are on the back themselves of the great space turtle, the great Atuine, who is flying through space, which is actually based on like I think a Hindu myth
Huh.
somewhere. I think there is actually a celestial turtle, giant turtle, upon which there are elephants on the back of it. Yes, we looked this up when I was talking to people about Discworld.
Mhm.
So even that is kind of rooted in kind of actual mythology, and on it, it's like a pre-industrial world. Some of the Discworld books are about the discovery of like the steam engine and establishing a postal service or establishing a mint where you're printing money or a printing press, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
But it just is kind of parody of fantasy novels while also being satire of the real world. Like
Mhm.
we were talking about with the guards books, they take all those noir detective tropes. And the city watch are just like they're the night watch of the city.
Mhm.
And there's always a murder, and it's just one big case that they follow. And so it parodies cop shows, detective novels, noir
Mhm.
novels, complete with femme fatales and turns of fate. And then you have the wizard subseries, which is about this cowardly wizard who is always fleeing from trouble, and that's really kind of your like globe trotting. That's where you kind of like see the world, because he's always running from one location to another.
Mhm.
um, there's the Agatian Empire, which is very, very much our China. The 4X continent he runs to, which is like our Australia. There's Clatch, which is like an analogous to our Middle East,
Hmm.
and so yeah, so there's him, and then that also kind of is very Lovecraftian, some because his magic sometimes pulls him into the dungeon dimensions, which are very filled with like Lovecraftian, like
Oh,
unspeakable beasts. So
interesting.
even there, he's parodying like horror books. The witch novels, which follow these three witches, literally, like one of them opens where they're cackling on the blasted heath and they go, "When shall we three meet again?" Just like from the beginning of Macbeth.
Uh-huh.
And one of them pulls out a day planner and is like, "Well, I can do next Tuesday." And they're like, "Well, I can't do Tuesday. Our Darren's getting his teeth removed." And they're like literally arguing over when they can actually meet again. And so the witches kind of they're out in the countryside, and they kind of parody like myths and fairy tales and stuff. So you see
Mhm.
like evil fairy godmothers or wicked witches that are, or good witches. And
Mhm.
there's one where they go to like Genua, which is like New Orleans and the kind of the voodoo um, stuff.
Mhm.
And also vampires. Like he takes fantasy tropes and turns them on their head. In Discworld, vampires are sophisticated, and they use garlic in their food, and they wear crosses around their neck, and because they've just like kind of, they think it's so passe to be afraid of these things that other vampires were. um and the werewolves are very where the watch is about the law, the werewolves are about the lore. They're like steeped in like this Transylvanian like mythos about what it means to be like a werewolf and stuff. So they kind of cultivate that fear, even though none of it's really true. They just kind of
Mhm.
cultivate this air of mystery. And so really, whatever fantasy trope there is, Pratchett plays with it, and he does it. I don't know an author who has a better mastery of the English language
Yeah.
than the late Sir Terry Pratchett. Like, he knows exactly what he's doing when he chooses a word that has a double meaning here to make just this masterful pun. He's just like
Yeah.
his just observation of human behavior. There's a line about Colin, who is like, and Sergeant Colin is just, he's this overweight, like just everyman, just really like, just kind of, he's not never going to get promoted. He's just your average guy. And
Mhm.
it says Colin was educated at the school of it stands to reason he got his master's degree from My Dad Always Says and is currently getting his postdoctorate from What Some Bloke Told Me at the Pub. And it's like, we all know people like that who like, they're like, oh, well, you heard it somewhere, so please pass it off as like, it stands to reason, right?
Yeah.
And so it just makes all this just like really specific. That's where the humor comes from. It's very, very specific.
Yeah.
He just is such a master of his craft.
Yeah.
While also building characters that are at the same time zany, but some of the most real characters that I've read in fantasy. Like they're human like we are. And it's just like, I just can't say enough for Pratchett. Now everyone isn't going to like Pratchett. Like I think like the opening of Guards with the elucidated brethren. I think if you don't think that's funny, you're not going to like Discworld.
Yeah. I mean, I thought it was very funny, which it's funny. I tried to read it to my husband and he was like, what? I was like, it's funny. He's like, well, I'm glad you're enjoying this.
I do think that Discworld is one of these things that has to be read rather than, I think it's one of these things that benefits from being read rather than like having read to you, like in an audiobook.
I feel I could see it doing well as a skit. I mean, if like Monty Python acted it out, that would work. But I hear you on that. I think it's like, it's a little confusing, but I thought that was hilarious. It made me laugh. It's
so funny.
Yeah. No, it's just interesting that it's this huge world. And I think, I've known they existed for such a long time. And I think as early as high school, I had people being like, yeah, you should read this. And I was like, I don't know. It seems weird. And honestly, this is probably petty, but part of what probably put me off is the original covers are really ugly.
So like the British ones are hideous. Like the original UK covers are so ugly.
Yeah.
Like I agree. No, they're hideous. Paul Kidby is a very talented artist, but I do not like his cover work.
Yeah. No, he
does some of the internal like illustrations from like the illustrated ones, and they're fantastic. Like, but those covers, I mean, I think that's the direction he was given, but I do not like them.
Yeah, I mean, even the style of the covers I could see working better as an internal illustration, but for a cover, it's just not.
One, they're too busy, way too busy.
Yeah. It's a lot going on, which is why I think when I did decide to read Guards, I got one of the fancy hardcover editions, which had beautiful covers. Unfortunately, they're a little pricey, so I don't know how quickly I will acquire them, but they're very pretty.
Well, those actually go on sale every now and then where they're like half price with like $12, which is way better.
That is pretty good. I'll have to keep an eye out for that. Interesting. Okay, good to know. Okay, one thing too is there are just kind of these random oddball things, like the fact that the librarian is an orangutan.
So that comes in the second book. He's a wizard, like because the Unseen University is the Wizard Academy, and this is where. For J.K. Rowling was very well versed in Discworld. Like she based some of her stuff based on stuff that she borrowed from Pratchett with her Wizard University. And in the second book, Rincewind, that magic that's out of control that kind of summons the dungeon dimension creatures, it kind of goes berserk, and that's where he gets turned into an orangutan. Okay. It's just a random blast of magic. But the thing is at the end, he doesn't want to go back. He likes being an orangutan better because no one, like, he doesn't have to talk to people anymore. He can just hang out with his books. And so that happens in book 2, and he stays that way throughout every single Discworld book. It likes being an orangutan. He can get around. He can get around the library easier. I mean, you saw in Guards, there's something called L space where libraries are bigger on the inside.
And
than they are on the outside.
They can cross sort of time and dimensions. That was so interesting. Yeah.
And so it deals a lot. The library is a really, really mystical place in Discworld. And so we see a lot of action in the library where it's like that kind of like threadbare walls between dimensions happen, where all of these books and all of these words meet. And then, it's Pratchett's love letter to the power of words. Like Pratchett knew that words have so much power, and I just love the way he harnessed his in writing these. I love Discworld so much.
I love it. I mean, I love that you're so excited about it too, and I think that's part of what made me want to try it. I was like, okay, I really need to just do this and
Yeah.
give it a try.
I did not mention the final subseries, which is Death. Death is pretty much everyone's favorite character in the Discworld. Everyone who's read multiple Discworld books, really, they like Death the most. I am slightly different in that I prefer Vimes, the class hero. But Death he views what he does as a job, and he's very sad that people aren't happy to see him because he's very lonely, but he understands that his job is to usher souls into the afterlife.
Yeah.
And so he shows up, and so Death's books constantly deal with they're the most like philosophical and kind of existential of the Discworld novels, because they always ask questions about what it means to be alive, and what the purpose of existence and what the purpose of humanity is. And in the first book, he takes on an apprentice, and Pratchett even knew what people say about teachers. There's a line in Mort where he's like, "It appears, boy, that you have no discernible skills at all. Have you considered teaching?" And it's just like, you got it, Pratchett, you know. And so he takes on an apprentice, and once he has this apprentice, he's like, you know what? I'm going to go on vacation because that's something that humans do. And so he has this house because he knows that people are supposed to live in houses. And he has a bathroom because he knows houses are supposed to have bathrooms. And he knows there's supposed to be fancy towels in the bathroom, but the towels don't work because Death doesn't know he doesn't understand how towels work. He just knows that you're supposed to have them. So he's the Grim Reaper who desperately wants to be human and wants to connect. And so like you feel for Death a lot because we all have that desire for connection. And in the second one, he's fired. And so he's like, okay. And so he becomes a farmer, and he doesn't want to go back to being Death. He just wants to, his name is Bill Dorr, and he just wants to farm on his farmland. And then in one, his granddaughter has to take over because he becomes a rock star. He's like, you know what, I'm going to go play music. And then he becomes Santa Claus in one, and then he has to like sort out, like someone literally steals time. And so he's got to go sort that one out. And that one is super philosophical. But he's always trying to not be Death. He wants to be anything but the Grim Reaper. And it's just so relatable. And so people really, really like him. He also has a sidekick called the Death of Rats, where it's literally a mouse skeleton that kills mice instead of people.
Oh, man. Yeah, well, it's interesting because in Guards, you do see these like mini scenes when people die where I guess Death comes to get them. So that's interesting.
Yeah, he's in pretty much every single book. But his series, he's like the main character. Watching him be Santa Claus that is what sold me on Discworld, is Hogfather. And the BBC actually did a TV movie of Hogfather that is actually pretty good. My wife hasn't read any Discworld, but I showed her the movie and she actually liked it.
Okay.
Death is just so funny. We can talk about Guards.
Yeah.
I really like him playing on 1,000,000 to 1 chances, because people are like, that's 1,000,000 to 1. And they're sitting there trying
to calculate whether it's actually 1,000,000 to 1.
Correct, because you've never heard the phrase, it's a 999,885 to 1 chance, but it just might work. You never hear that.
Yeah.
Only it's 1,000,000 to 1 chance, but it just might work.
So we better make it harder to make sure that it's 1,000,000 to 1.
Correct. So they blindfold themselves, stand on one foot, like spin around and make themselves. And it's just like, who thinks of that stuff to play on something that is just, he takes all this conventional wisdom and examines it, and then, does something with it, like plays against it. It's just really, really funny.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. And then I think is it the Patrician?
Oh, I love the Patrician.
He's so interesting. He, he has all of these plans. He's like, never build a dungeon that you wouldn't want to spend time in. So, when he gets put in the dungeon, he's like, I'm just going to run everything from here. I have a plan. It's fine.
Yes. The Patrician is so many fantasy authors try that kind of like hyper intelligent, like very aristocratic, sophisticated gentleman villain, right? And so many times they do not succeed. Where Terry Pratchett here with the patrician in really all of the books that he's in is the perfect example of that archetype, because he really has thought ahead. He
Yeah.
really does know everything in advance. He's a combination of Machiavelli and the Medici merchant princes from Renaissance, Italy, and that's what Pratchett had in mind when he wrote him. So these diabolical merchant princes, because Lorenzo Medici was completely cutthroat, and then we all know Machiavelli certainly was, and so the patrician is those guys writ large. And so he does, like, he's the evil overlord and he has a dungeon, but he also knows that, every now and then there's revolution and they might throw you into the dungeon. So you need to be prepared to spend there. Also, he could get out if he wanted to. He stays there by choice,
Right.
because, he's going to let Vimes do what he needs to do. And so I love that he is really good at predicting what people are going to do. And in I think it's in the third book, his assistant is like, because the patrician uses Vimes, this class hero, to keep the aristocrats in line, because where Vetinari has to pretend, where he's kind of like, he has to pretend with the aristocrats and like be like, oh no, you still have power. Oh, don't worry. It's not just me that's in charge. He has to let them feel important. He instead riles Vimes up and lets Vimes go after the aristocrats. And so his assistant is like, sir, like, I think if Vimes didn't exist, you would have had to create him. And the patrician's like, I rather think I did, because he did, because the patrician,
of course he did.
I know. And so it's just brilliant the way there's a scene at the end of every one of the guards books between Vimes and the patrician. There's always a patrician confrontation scene at the end. And they're always some of the most tense and some of the most like layered with subtext, as people are saying, as they're saying things but meaning other things.
Yeah.
And it's just so good. And Vimes is constantly like, yes, sir. And like pretending like, what, sir? I don't know what you mean, sir. And Vetinari's like, you know exactly what I mean, Vimes. Like, if you say sir with that stupid look on your face one more time, I'm going to be upset. And he's like, oh, sorry, sir. Because they both know how to get under each other's skin. It's just such a great relationship between the ruler of the city and the guy in charge of keeping the peace.
Yeah. Well, I just found him so interesting because, I can see the Machiavelli thing, and that makes a lot of sense. But I think he thinks he's right. Like, he thinks that he knows what human nature is, and this is just the way things are. And my job is just to make sure things are actually functioning and be kind of this puppet master, like keeping everything moving smoothly. Which is interesting. And I think that's the thing, is writing a villain who doesn't think they're a villain is really the key to doing it well.
Yes. And you're right. Like, Vetinari, he understands human nature so much, which is why he doesn't get rid of crime. Instead, he makes it he sanctions it.
Yeah.
He organizes it to where it pays taxes.
Right.
And that's why no one really ever overthrows him, because they're like, well, we hate Vetinari, but at least stuff works. Like, there's no disruption of trade and all that stuff. And so I think you're right. He thinks that he knows everything. And then people like Carrot, who behave completely selflessly, without any regard for their self-interest, those are the kind of people that throw him for a loop. Like, I don't think Vetinari can predict Carrot's behavior.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't act like other people. He doesn't have a self-interested bone in his body.
Yeah. Yeah, which I think is so interesting, right? Having somebody who's like, this is just how humanity writ large is.
Correct.
And doesn't believe that anybody can be truly heroic or selfless.
Yes.
And so if someone is, it's like, wait, what? And I love that.
What's your angle?
Yeah, which, and I've met people who are more cynical about humanity and feel that way in real life. So I think it's interesting too, because like, I know people like maybe not running a city, for instance, but I've known people with worldviews similar to the patrician and more similar to Carrot. And I just think that the tension there is really, really interesting. And Vimes, like the fact that he will push back and in some ways sort of stand up
Oh, 100%. And Vimes, there's a line in one of the books where Carrot catches these guys who are like tangential to the crime or whatever, and something they made ended up killing this woman and her child, but they live in like the shades, which is the ghetto, the slums of Ankh-Morpork. And he catches them, and he's like, guys, your thing caused the death of a woman and her child. And the guy says, were they important? And Carrot loses his smile and is like, I was feeling bad for you, but it is your lucky day that I caught you before Vimes did, because that is so indicative of what makes Vimes such an amazing character. If you said that to Vimes, like Vimes would go spare, as they say in the watch books. Vimes, that is the exact kind of attitude that Vimes is antithetical towards. That idea that somehow certain lives are worth more than others. And Vimes, and that is what I love so much about Vimes, is he is not going to stand for the aristocrats, the people at the top, acting like their lives are more important than the people he grew up with, because he grew up in the slums. And so that's what just makes Vimes such a relatable character, in that like how dare you ask if they were important? Like, they died. Like, of course they were important, but most people don't feel that way. And so Vimes is just such I love Commander Vimes.
Yeah, no, I see that, and I think he's interesting. I mean, one thing too that we could talk about with it is he has in this book sort of a romance subplot.
Yes.
which is very entertaining.
Yes, it's so bizarre because Vimes and Lady Sybil, who is from one of the oldest families in Ankh-Morpork. She's one of the oldest aristocratic families.
Yeah.
She's one of the wealthiest women in the city. And that is what makes it it's just such a great juxtaposition, because he marries in to this high society that he despises.
They end up getting married.
They're married at the start of book 2.
Okay.
And so, or maybe maybe the thing is he's getting married in book 2. But so he marries into this society and he despises it. And so she simultaneously tries to get him to, do his duty as a member of the nobility, but she also knows that you cannot take the watchman out of Vimes. Like, he also has to have the chase. He's got to hunt the criminals. And so it's really interesting watching Vimes. But again, the patrician even uses that to his advantage. So he starts, since Vimes is now part of the aristocracy, he now throws Vimes as an aristocrat at the aristocracy, because Vimes doesn't know how to politic at all. Like, he doesn't all of the the sneaky and double speak, he just like says it like it is and says, yeah, that's dumb. Like, that's ridiculous. I'm not going to do that. Like, no. And everyone just gets up in arms. And that's the way Vetinari likes it. The patrician likes the nobility kind of off their game, like not on even footing. And so it's just wonderful, the relationship between Vimes and Sybil. And it's in book 5 of the Watch, the Fifth Elephant. She finally, like, we learn a lot more about Sybil and a lot more about their relationship. And it's just really touching and really well done. And this is something that is really one of the worst offenses about the TV show, The Watch, that just came out in January. First of all, it's so bad. It's so bad that Terry Pratchett's daughter says, yeah, it bears no DNA to my dad's watch at all.
Wow.
Neil Gaiman said that it's the watch, the same way that a guy in a yellow trench coat who hangs around with bats is Batman. Like, it's
oh, wow, Neil Gaiman.
What they do is there's so much bad about it, but what ticks me off the most is that Sybil is a big woman. She is described as like a Wagnerian like lady. She is large, and that's part of her backstory. She's always been large. Like, she's not this svelte, beautiful woman. She's this big lady who keeps dragons
Mhm.
like normal like other spinster women would keep cats. You know
Yeah,
what I
which
mean?
I liked it. I thought she was so interesting, and
Yes. And the
even
thing,
well, and even at the end of at the end of Guards, when she kind of, well, it's funny too because she basically sort of seduces him into a relationship, which,
yes.
like, that whole process is so funny to me. But his thought process is like, well, she's, I don't remember exactly what he thinks, but something along the lines of like realizing, well, I guess she is pretty attractive, and like, I'm not gonna, like, better than anybody else I would meet. I don't know. It's just like the
Yeah,
whole thing made
Vimes
me
doesn't
laugh.
he didn't really even think about
Yeah.
that stuff. He's just like, um, she just yeah, I mean, they just it's a really organic relationship.
Yeah.
Like, it's not forced or like, but another great thing about Sybil is at the end, she asks them not to kill the dragon
Yeah.
that's like been killing people, because
Yeah.
that is where Sybil's strength comes from, is her compassion and her
Mhm.
mercy.
Mhm.
And in this TV show, one, they make her this pretty skinny woman,
Of course they do. They always
and
do that.
yeah, and they make her BA. Like,
Oh.
they make her an axe wielding, like super heroine, like a
Oh,
Lara
no.
Croft type. And it's just like, that is not, and she even has a line where like, you have to, if you want power, you have to take it, to
Oh, no.
Vimes. That
No.
is not who Sybil is.
No.
Sybil is not this Amazon like awesome fighter. She's just a woman who's not super comfortable in her own skin,
Mhm.
who has a lot of like love to give to both humankind and animal kind,
Mhm.
and making her this fighting warrior is completely antithetical to the point.
Yeah.
Pratchett is saying that compassion and mercy is strength.
Yeah.
It's so frustrating that
Yeah.
that's what they think we all want.
Of course. Yeah, no, I definitely see that. No, I think she's such an interesting character, and I imagined her kind of like, oh, I don't know who. I can't quite put my finger on it, but like, I know there's a character from a movie or something somewhere that she reminds me of. But kind of, but almost like more of like a gentle giant type lady. I don't know. You know
Yeah,
what I mean? Like very tall and imposing, but kind, and takes care of all these dragons, and is very nerdy, and
she's like a
she'll
female Hagrid.
yes, yes,
Yeah,
exactly,
she's like
yes.
a female
She is
Hagrid.
like a female that's yeah, she's like a female Hagrid, and she'll, if you get her started, she'll go off on all of these the minutia of
Of dragon
dragon
nursing.
habitats and
Yeah,
dragon diseases, and it's just like, I'm like, okay, yes, yeah,
yeah,
I think it's great.
yeah. So she's such a good character. And there's a female Watchman that comes in the second book, who's also a really great kind of strong female character as
Hmm.
well. She's much more like, she's like the straightest of the straight men when it comes to like comedic. She is absolutely plays it straight, even more so than Carrot.
Oh,
So
wow.
she is like the like serious one that there's really no joke about her at all. Like, with Carrot's the straight man, but he's also the like, I take everything super literally.
Yeah.
But she has her own thing that makes her special. But
Okay.
that is a spoiler. The stuff about Sybil isn't, but that is a spoiler.
Okay. Good to know.
But it's just great. Like,
Yeah.
and with every subsequent book, it touches more and more on the character work with Vimes, Carrot, Angua, and Sybil especially. Colin and Nobbs are supposed to be static. Like,
Mhm.
they're just the ignorant masses. That's what they are. They're
Mhm.
the mob. They have the opinions of the masses. They're just like, they're kind of stand-in for the culture at large.
Mhm.
And so when they say dumb, insensitive, kind of like inappropriate things, we look at them and are like, well, at least we're not Colin and Nobby, and they kind of learn from their mistakes as well. And that's why Vimes is so great, is that he's ignorant, but he's not dumb enough to know that he isn't ignorant. Like, as he gets new information, he's like, oh, I guess I just hated trolls and dwarves because that's just what you do. These
Mhm.
guys are fine. Like,
Mhm.
Vimes overcomes his prejudices,
Hmm.
which also makes him a great character.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I think talking through it, you realize how much nuance there is
Yeah.
to the book, which it is impressive, and just the sheer volume of wordplay. It's
Oh
like,
yeah.
it's all the time. It's amazing
Yeah,
that he's able to
wordplay
do
and
that.
pop cultural references.
Mhm.
Like there's references in that book in Guards to Casablanca, Dirty
Yes,
Harry. Yeah.
okay, I caught the Casablanca one. That was funny.
Um, there's
Where he's like, and isn't that like at the romance thing? He needs to say something, and he's like, he said the first thing that popped into his head. Here's looking at you, kid.
exactly. And this is stuff that it's fine if you don't know what the reference is, but when you understand the reference,
Yeah.
like it works on another level. And that's
Mhm.
why every time I go back and read Discworld, because I know more than I did the last time I read,
Mhm.
I always catch new stuff.
That's fun.
I mean, even the motto on their badge in Latin, it literally says "Make my day, punk." That's what the motto on their badge says. So it's a Dirty Harry
That's funny.
reference.
That's funny. Yeah, well, and I think even I can't think of any examples off the top of my head right now, but I was noticing too frequently the names that he would use would have kind of double meanings to them that I thought were funny.
Yeah,
Um,
he has. Can you think of any?
I'm see. This is I should have taken notes while I was reading.
There's one from the book I just finished. There's an orphan whose name is the Artful Nudger instead of the Artful Dodger, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, are
Yeah,
you kidding me?
that's funny.
It's just stuff like that all the time.
Yeah. Well, I even thought the way it was originally introduced, like colon is interesting because it's similar to Colin, which is actually a name, but it's a little different, and it's like
Yeah,
the body part basically,
yeah,
which is appropriate for his
it is.
character. So like think little stuff like that I just think is funny, or I'm gonna have to
I
think
I
about.
love with Colin that Vimes wonders because they have like 6 children and he works all night and she works all day. So Vimes is like, he assumed they had 6 children through the use of very persuasive handwriting
Yeah,
because they leave each other notes because they never see each other.
yeah,
So Vimes is like, how do they have children? So it must have been some steamy
yeah,
notes.
yeah.
It's just ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, and then at the end, like when he gets a pay raise, he's like, well, my wife's very happy with me. She's writing much nicer notes.
Yeah, and at the end, when literally Patrician's expecting them to ask for all these things for saving the city, and they ask for a slight pay raise
Yeah.
and a dartboard.
And a new kettle.
Oh, and a new kettle, and they're terrified to ask him for
They're
it.
terrified for the dartboard. They're like, it was a step too far. We're
Exactly,
never
they
gonna
thought
get
they
it.
went too far asking for the dartboard, and he thinks they're going to ask for like a bunch of riches.
Oh
It's
yeah,
just,
yeah.
it's hysterical, and
Yeah.
that comes back into play in the second book, the
Mhm.
dartboard.
Yeah.
It's just so funny.
There were just like so many small things that were throughout the book that I just found funny. Or even, when they're trying to get somebody to stop the dragon, and they're like, oh, we'll pay 50,000 whatever, and all of the monster hunters are like, no, you're supposed to give us half your kingdom and your daughter. Well, he doesn't have a
Yes.
daughter, so forget it.
Exactly. Like, and that's playing on the standard, like, fairy tale tropes. Like, if you
Mhm.
save the kingdom, you get to marry the king's daughter.
Exactly. But the patrician doesn't have a daughter. Like, he has an aunt.
I forgot about he has an aunt. I forgot about he has an aunt.
Yeah.
That's good stuff.
Yeah.
That is good stuff.
Oh man, no, it's really funny. So for anybody listening, like hopefully this is encouraging you to at least give them a try, because
Yeah.
I'm glad I did, and I will probably read more of them in the future. It's
Well,
it's fun.
my Discworld crew over in my Discord, we use it as kind of palate cleansers between all these like, really heavy fantasies that
Oh
we're
yeah.
constantly reading. Like sometimes it's just like, you read like, 80 books a month. So
I mean,
and
not quite, but
from,
yeah, I do. I
from,
read a lot.
from various genres, like, but I
Yeah.
mean, we're over here reading like nothing but just fantasy and just like the law, like, oh, everybody dies. And it's
Right.
so like, see, reading a Discworld book after that is just like, it's like stepping outside in a cool breeze to just
Yeah.
like reset. So
I
they
can totally
really,
see
really
that.
help from getting out of slumps.
I see that. I probably use romance that way.
Nice. Yeah.
But yeah, no, I see how that would definitely be helpful because it's true. Like you can only do so much. Like grim things are at
Oh,
the end of the
just,
world.
just depressed. I need to watch Vimes arrest a bad guy.
Right. Yeah. So, okay, so I guess maybe kind of last thing is like, what would you encourage people to start? I mean, we have talked about the Guards Guard is a good place to start.
Yeah.
Do you have recommendations in terms of depending on people's genre preferences, for instance, like
Yeah.
what are some good entry points into Discworld?
Well, if you like really old school fantasy, like Conan the Barbarian, stuff like that,
Mhm,
that is very much start with Color of Magic at the beginning, the very first book, because that is really kind of the tropes it plays with.
mhm,
Like there's this barbarian group called the Silver Horde, where they're all like octogenarian barbarians, like 80-year-old barbarians, like that have like conquered the countryside. So it's very sword and sorcery, like the old, those old, bikini clad women, fantasy art kind of
mhm,
thing.
mhm,
It's very much that style. So if you're a fan of like the old school, like Conan the Barbarian stuff, start with Color of Magic. If you are into like fairy tales and theater, go with the witch books. Start with Equal Rights, because Weird Sisters is literally Macbeth, but like it's like a play within a play, and there's a duke and his evil wife, and the witches are the quote unquote witches from Macbeth. It's
great.
fantastic.
I'm gonna have to do the witches. It sounds
Oh,
very much up my alley.
yeah, and also Masquerade, that book of the witches, is literally based on the Phantom of the Opera, so it's filled with
Ah,
musical theater references and stuff.
oh, that's fun.
So the witches are definitely, and the witches are hilarious. Like they're Granny Weatherwax is your standard wicked witch, but she's not. She's just wants to be left alone. And then you have the standard like kind of like witch that. When people assume we're witch, like the granny of the town, she's like the herbalist, and is related to like everybody, and has like 10 kids, and she's also the midwife that delivers everybody's babies and has
Mhm,
all the old wives' tale remedies.
mhm.
Her name's Nanny Ogg, and she has this demon cat that looks like it's like one big scar because it gets in fights all the time. It's got one eye and an eye patch. um, and then there's the young witch in training who's like, she's just like, oh, but can we pick flowers? And they're like, no, like, come on, quit picking flowers. Um, and so that's for that. If you're interested in like I said, the philosophical, more like existential works, the death books, start with Mort, are the way to go.
Mhm.
Detective noir stuff, it's the Guards, and yeah, those are all really good starting places. There's
Great.
a standalone called Small Gods that is pretty good as a starting place, where it's just a book by itself. I like to read that a little later after you understand a little more about like the Discworld,
Mhm.
but it can be a good starting place as well, where one of these, like, it's essentially Zeus gets turned into a little turtle, and so he can't smite people anymore. So it's this really angry turtle hanging around with one of his acolytes, like being like, smite that person, and he can only make like little static sparks appear, and he's like, dang it, I cannot smite them, turn me back. So
Oh,
it's really
man.
funny.
That's great. Awesome. Well, I think that is hopefully really helpful for anybody who's interested in getting into the series.
I hope
And
so.
thank you for coming on and talking about it, because I think
Thank you for having me.
so
This is
interesting.
fun.
Yeah, this was really fun, and I will definitely need to read more. Guys, if you want to check out Alan's channel, it will be linked in the show notes. He's very funny and talks about a lot of great sci-fi fantasy stuff on YouTube. Again, this has been Chapter 3 Podcast, and I'm your host, Bethany. You can follow us on Twitter at Chapter 3 Podcast, and you can also find me on YouTube at Beautifully Bookish Bethany, talking about even more books. Our next episode is going to be available in 2 weeks, so tune back in then. And the bonus content for this episode, which we'll be recording right after this, is going to be available to patrons in the next few days. Thanks for listening.